Hello, friends. We think we know the Roman Empire as the pinnacle of civilization, law, and order, but beneath the marble columns lay a reality stranger than fiction. Today, our leaders are scrutinized by the press and laws. Back then, the emperor was a living god with zero accountability. This absolute power didn't just corrupt, it created a surreal theater of the absurd, where the whims of one man were the only rules that mattered. We're talking about men who declared war on the ocean, forcing their confused soldiers to charge into the surf and stab the waves with their swords. We find rulers who appointed their favorite horses to the Senate, and others who smothered their dinner guests to death in falling flower petals just for a laugh. It is a haunting, bizarre side of history that often gets left out of the standard textbooks. I am just a guy reading stories from the past, so if you would like to stay for the journey, please consider subscribing. Before we travel back to the ancient shadows of the Palatine Hill, let me know, where are you listening from tonight? Now take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let us step into the madness of Rome. The air shifts as we ascend. The Palatine Hill rises before us, not as a mere geographic feature, but as the altar of the ancient world. Here, the ground itself feels heavy, saturated with the weight of decisions that once redirected the course of rivers and the fate of nations. To understand the strange, often terrifying behavior of the men who lived atop this hill, we must first understand the impossible architecture of their power. We must look past the ruins and the dust to see the world as they saw it, from a height that no human being was ever meant to occupy. At the heart of this power was a single, terrifying word: imperium. In the early days of the Republic, this was a legal term, a temporary grant of authority given to generals and magistrates. It was the right to command, the right to execute, the right to speak with the voice of the state. But as the Republic withered and the empire took root, imperium transformed. It became something absolute, something eternal, and something deeply toxic to the human psyche. It was no longer a tool of the office, it was the skin of the man. The man at the center of this storm did not call himself a king. That would have been too simple, too honest for the Roman temperament. Instead, he was the princeps, the first citizen. It was a polite fiction, a mask of modesty worn to soothe the pride of a people who still dreamed of liberty. But beneath that mask was a reality that defied comprehension. The imperial palace was the physical manifestation of this isolation. It was not merely a home. It was a gilded cage, a sprawling complex of marble and gold, designed to separate the ruler from the ruled. Within these walls, reality was a curated performance. The emperor was surrounded by a sea of sycophants, slaves, and advisors, each one a potential assassin, each one a professional liar. Paranoia became the only logical response to such an environment. When your power is total, your vulnerability is also total. A single grain of hemlock in the wine, a single dagger hidden beneath a toga, a single misunderstood glance from a bodyguard. These were the shadows that danced on the palace walls at night. In this atmosphere of unlimited indulgence and constant fear, the mind begins to warp. The emperor was told he was a god, and in every practical sense, he functioned as one. He controlled the weather of men's lives. He could turn a beggar into a senator, or a general into a corpse before lunch. This disconnect from the normal human experience created a vacuum where empathy used to live. In its place grew the bizarre habits, the cruel eccentricities, and the desperate search for sensation that would eventually define the lives of men like Caligula, Nero, and Commodus. They were not necessarily born as monsters. Many began their reigns with the best of intentions, promising justice and prosperity. But the throne of the Caesars was a transformative seat. It stripped away the constraints of morality and replaced them with the vertigo of the infinite. As we walk through the corridors of the Palatine, we are walking through the wreckage of the human spirit. We are seeing what happens when the fragile machinery of the mind is forced to process the power of a deity. The madness was not a bug in the system. It was the inevitable feature of a world where one man was everything and everyone else was nothing. The stage is set, the gold is polished, and the air is thick with the scent of incense and blood. Now, let us look closer at the men who broke under the weight of the world. To understand the fracture, we must first understand the foundation. The Roman Republic was built on a foundation of shared power and a visceral, almost religious hatred for the concept of kingship. For centuries, the Roman identity was forged in the halls of the Senate, where stern men in wool togas debated the fate of the Mediterranean with a focus on tradition, law, and the collective authority of the state. It was a system designed to ensure that no single man could ever hold the sun in his hands. But that world eventually collapsed under the weight of its own success, giving way to a new era where the destiny of millions rested on the whims of a single family. The transition was not a sudden explosion, but a calculated transformation led by Augustus. He was a master of the polite fiction, a man who claimed to restore the Republic while quietly dismantling its heart. He did not call himself a king. He chose the title princeps, or first citizen. This title suggested he was merely the first among equals, a servant of the people. Yet, in this subtle shift, the seeds of divine madness were sown. The state was no longer a machine of laws, but a reflection of one man's psyche. When the focus of a civilization moves from the institution to the individual, the stability of that civilization becomes tethered to the sanity of its ruler. Augustus set a standard that was nearly impossible to maintain. He cultivated an image of the emperor as a stoic, tireless guardian of the Roman peace. This was the birth of the personality cult. In every corner of the empire, from the sands of Egypt to the forests of Germania, statues were erected to project this image. Look at the marble faces preserved in our museums. They are masterpieces of deception. They show us Augustus as an eternally youthful, serene commander, an icon of stability and divine right. They are masks of unshakable competence. But behind these stone facades, the private reality of the court was beginning to ferment into something far more volatile. The pressure of succession was the first crack in the marble. Augustus had no biological son to follow him. and the desperate search for an heir created a house atmosphere of jealousy and intrigue. The young men of the Julio-Claudian line were raised with the terrifying knowledge that they were not just heirs to a political office, but to a godhood. They were told from birth that their whim was law, that their anger was a storm, and that their pleasure was a command. This is a heavy inheritance for any human mind to carry. When a child is raised in a world where no one ever says no, the tether to shared reality begins to fray before they even reach adulthood. This leads us to the enduring mystery of the Julio-Claudian curse. History has long struggled to explain why this specific bloodline, the descendants of the most calculated and brilliant man in Rome, spiraled so spectacularly into erratic behavior and cruelty. One theory suggests the cause was environmental. The Roman elite lived in a world saturated with lead. It lined their aqueducts, it formed the vessels they drank from, and it was even used as an artificial sweetener in their wine. We know now that chronic lead poisoning leads to irritability, paranoia, and cognitive decline. It is a chilling thought that the rulers of the known world were unwittingly rotting their own minds with the very luxuries their empire provided. Others look to the family tree itself. To keep the divine blood pure and the power concentrated, the Julio-Claudians engaged in a narrow, inward-looking cycle of marriages. Cousins married cousins, and uncles married nieces. They were attempting to preserve a lineage of greatness, but they may have instead been concentrating a genetic predisposition for mental instability. The fragility of the mind was being passed down along with the purple robes of office. However, the most terrifying explanation for their behavior might be the simplest, the corrupting nature of absolute power. There is a specific kind of vertigo that comes from standing at the top of the world. In the old republic, a man's peers kept him grounded. In the empire, the emperor stood alone. The transition from the stern ancestral customs of the past to the absolute dominance of the Palatine Hill meant that the emperor was no longer bound by the rules of men. Walk through the Roman Forum today, and you see the noble, immovable faces of the statues. They look like men who could never lose their grip. But if you could step behind the heavy silk curtains of the Imperial palace, you would find a different world. In those private rooms, the air was thick with the scent of incense and the cold sweat of fear. The public propaganda spoke of a golden age, but the private reality was a descent into a labyrinth of shadows. The stage was set for a series of men who would discover that when you are a god, the only thing left to conquer is your own sanity. They were the masters of the world, yet they were becoming slaves to their own darkest impulses. The weight of the world was finally starting to show its cracks. For Tiberius, that weight was a suffocating shroud. He was a man who never truly wanted the crown, a grim soldier who preferred the cold discipline of the muddy frontiers to the marble halls and sycophantic whispers of the Palatine Hill. As those cracks in the imperial facade widened, he did something that shocked the ancient world. He did not fight to mend the social fabric of Rome. He simply walked away from it. In the year 26, the most powerful man on earth turned his back on the capital, seeking a sanctuary where the salt air could bleach away the stench of politics. He chose a jagged, beautiful rock rising out of the Tyrrhenian Sea, the Isle of Capri. This was no mere vacation, it was a permanent retreat into a fortress of the mind. From the heights of the Villa Jovis, perched precariously on the island's eastern cliffs, Tiberius looked down upon the world as if from another planet. While he sat in his high gardens, Rome began to rot from the inside out. He left the city in the hands of the ambitious and bloodthirsty Sejanus, the head of his Praetorian Guard, essentially handing the keys of the empire to a wolf while he watched the sunset. The distance between the ruler and the ruled grew from a few miles of sea to a canyon of total indifference. In his isolation, the emperor's natural austerity curdled into something far more sinister. The silence of Capri was not peaceful. It was heavy with the breath of a man who had lost all touch with his own humanity. The rumors that began to trickle back to the mainland were the stuff of nightmares, painted by historians with a mixture of horror and disbelief. They spoke of a man who had transformed his private villas into theaters of the grotesque. The most infamous of these tales concerned the minnows. It is said that Tiberius, bored by the conventional pleasures of the flesh, took to the water. He supposedly filled his sea grottos with young children, trained to swim around him as he bathed, nibbling at him like small fish. Whether these accounts were the exaggerations of a bitter Roman Senate or the literal truth of a fractured psyche, they pointed to a singular, terrifying transformation. To Tiberius, people were no longer citizens or even subjects. They were biological curiosities, toys to be used until they were broken. The emperor's paranoia acted as a dark companion to his hedonism. On Capri, no one was safe, not even the guests invited to his table. He lived in a state of constant vibrating suspicion, convinced that every rustle of the wind or shadow on the wall was an assassin's blade. This fear manifested in a cruelty that was as systematic as it was sudden. High above the sapphire waters stood the Salto di Tiberio, the leap of Tiberius. This sheer limestone drop of over 300 meters became the final destination for anyone who tripped over the emperor's mercurial temper. The process was handled with a chilling, bureaucratic coldness. A victim would be dragged to the edge of the precipice, the wind whipping at their clothes as they looked down at the distant churning foam below. After they were cast into the void, the emperor would watch their descent with a detached clinical interest. But the fall was not the end of the ritual. Tiberius was a man of meticulous detail, and he did not believe in leaving things to chance. At the base of the cliffs, teams of Marines waited in small boats, armed with oars and heavy hooks. If by some miracle a victim survived the impact with the water, these sailors were instructed to beat and pike the broken body until the life was extinguished. It was a closed loop of violence performed for an audience of one. As the years stretched on, the Isle of Capri became a symbol of a new and terrifying era. The Roman people began to realize that their master was no longer the first citizen or a protector of the Republic's ghost. He was a hermit king, a ghost in a high tower who sent letters of execution to Rome as casually as one might order a meal. The city he left behind was paralyzed. The Senate was terrified to move. The people were hungry for a leader who had vanished, and the machinery of state began to grind under the weight of his absence. Tiberius had set a dark and permanent precedent. He proved that the absolute power of the Caesars could be used not just for conquest or governance, but for the indulgence of personal madness. He had turned the empire into a private playground where the only law was the whim of the man on the mountain. By the time he breathed his last, the dignity of the office had been stripped away, replaced by the realization that the man on the throne could be a monster. The boundaries of what was acceptable had been pushed into the abyss, and the Roman world was now bracing itself for those who would follow. If Tiberius was the one who showed that human lives were disposable toys, his successors would soon show just how far that game could be played. The island retreat was just the beginning of a long descent into a divine and bloody insanity. If Tiberius was a cold, distant shadow lurking in the grottos of Capri, his successor arrived as a burst of golden light that promised a new dawn for the Roman people. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, did not just inherit a throne, he inherited a cult of personality that spanned the known world. He was the son of Germanicus, the most beloved general in the history of the empire, a man who had been the personification of Roman virtue. As a child, Gaius had been the mascot of the northern legions, dressed in a miniature soldier's uniform and wearing the tiny leather boots that earned him the nickname Little Boots. When he entered Rome to claim his inheritance, the city did not just celebrate, they wept with relief. After the dark, paranoid final years of Tiberius, the young, handsome Gaius was seen as a savior. But that relief was short-lived. That golden light would soon sharpen into a searing heat that scorched everything it touched, turning a beloved son into a monster whose name would become synonymous with the absolute corruption of power. The first months of his reign were a dream of generosity and reform. He recalled exiles, burned treason records, and poured wealth into public games. But then came the sickness. A mysterious, debilitating fever took hold of the young emperor, and for weeks the empire held its breath. When he finally rose from his bed, the man who emerged was unrecognizable. It was as if the fever had burned away his humanity, leaving behind something alien and predatory. The shift was not just psychological, it was existential. Caligula had decided that he was no longer a man, he was a god, and he expected the world to rearrange itself around that new reality. This divine obsession manifested in habits that blurred the line between the sacred and the ridiculous. He began to hold long, whispered conversations with the moon goddess Diana. In the dead of night, he would stand on the balconies of the Palatine hill, looking up at the silver orb and pleading with her to join him in his bed. He would argue with the goddess, scolding her for her distance or boasting of his own celestial status. Imagine the guards standing in the shadows, watching the master of the Mediterranean world debate the wind and the stars. It was a terrifying display of a mind that had detached from the earth, a man who found the company of mortals so beneath him that he sought companionship only in the heavens. If the moon would not descend to him, he would build a bridge to the gods himself, crossing the gap between the hills of Rome to converse with Jupiter. This disconnect from reality reached a fever pitch on the shores of the English Channel. The Roman war machine was the most disciplined force on the planet, and they had been marched to the northern edge of the continent for a grand purpose, the invasion of Britain. The legions stood in battle formation, their spears sharp and their shields polished, waiting for the signal to cross the water and conquer the wild tribes of the north. But the signal never came. Instead, Caligula ordered his men to line up along the beach as if facing an invisible enemy. He commanded the artillery to fire their projectiles into the rolling waves. He declared war on Neptune, the god of the sea, claiming the deity had insulted him. When the battle was over, he did not order a retreat. He commanded his hardened veterans, men who had survived the Germanic forests, to stoop down and fill their helmets and cloaks with seashells. He called these the spoils of the conquered ocean, and he insisted they be sent back to Rome as proof of his victory over the god of the depths. To the soldiers, it was a moment of profound humiliation. To Caligula, it was a demonstration of absolute will. He had forced the very tides to surrender, and he had forced the pride of Rome to play along with the fantasy. Perhaps no habit defined his reign more than his devotion to Incitatus, his favorite racehorse. This was no mere affection for an animal. Incitatus lived in a stable of solid marble, with a manger carved from ivory. He wore collars of precious stones and was draped in blankets of the finest imperial purple. Caligula provided the horse with a house and a full staff of slaves, claiming the animal needed a proper space to entertain guests. And the guests came. Senators and high-ranking officials were invited to formal banquets where the horse was the guest of honor, served gold-flecked barley, and toasted with wine from golden cups. The ultimate insult came when Caligula announced his intention to appoint Incitatus to the office of consul, the highest political position in the Roman state. For centuries, these stories have been used as a checklist of clinical insanity. But there is another perspective, one that paints Caligula not as a madman, but as a master of cruel political theater. By ordering his soldiers to pick up shells, he was breaking their spirit, reminding them that their loyalty was to him, not to the dignity of the military. By threatening to make his horse a consul, he was sending a lethal message to the Roman aristocracy. He was telling the Senate that their ancient offices and their hallowed traditions were so hollow that an animal could perform their duties just as well as they could. It was a deliberate, sadistic prank played on the grandest stage imaginable. He was testing the limits of absolute power, seeing how far he could push the people of Rome before they finally broke. He turned the empire into a hall of mirrors where no one knew what was real and everyone was terrified to ask. He had transformed the imperial office into a playground of the absurd, but the joke was reaching its bloody punchline. The divine emperor had forgotten one thing. Even a god can be reached by a dagger if the men holding them have been pushed far enough. After 4 years of terror, the theater was about to be closed by the very men who were sworn to protect the stage. The blood on the floor of the Palatine hill had barely dried before the curtains rose on a new kind of spectacle. While the daggers of the Praetorian Guard had ended one reign of terror, they had inadvertently cleared the stage for a man who did not see himself as a soldier, a statesman, or even a god in the traditional sense. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus looked into the mirror and saw something far more dangerous, a misunderstood genius. For the next 14 years, the Roman Empire would be transformed from a political entity into a captive audience for a man whose narcissism knew no bounds and whose stage was built upon the ashes of his own capital. The transition from military brutality to performative vanity was jarring for the Roman elite. Where previous emperors had found their identity in the conquest of foreign lands, Nero sought his glory in the vibration of a string. He was convinced that he possessed a voice that could rival Apollo, despite contemporary accounts suggesting his singing was thin and husky. But in Nero's Rome, reality was a secondary concern to the emperor's self-image. He did not merely suggest that people listen to him, he mandated it. When Nero took the stage with his lyre, the gates of the theater were bolted from the outside. Thousands of citizens were trapped for hours, sometimes days, as the emperor cycled through his repertoire. The Roman historian Suetonius recounts the absurdity of these sessions, where men would leap from the walls at the risk of breaking their legs just to escape the relentless sound of the imperial voice. Women were said to have gone into labor in the aisles, forbidden by the guards from leaving even for the birth of a child. To Nero, the applause was the only truth that mattered, even if that applause was orchestrated by 5,000 young men he had personally trained to clap in specific rhythmic patterns. This desperation for adoration was not confined to the sunlight of the theater. When the sun dipped below the 7 hills, the emperor's delusions took a more sinister, predatory turn. Nero would disguise himself in the clothes of a slave or a commoner, donning wigs and felt caps to prowl the darkened alleys of the city. In his mind, he was a hero of the underworld, a master of the night. In reality, he was a sovereign mugging his own subjects. He would break into shops, assault passers-by, and pick fights with senators who were unfortunate enough to be out after dark. If a victim had the audacity to strike back, they often found themselves facing a death sentence the following morning when they realized the common thug they had repelled was actually the master of the world. This was the core of Nero's disconnect. He wanted the thrill of the common man's life without ever surrendering the immunity of the divine. The defining moment of his reign and the ultimate expression of his artistic delusion arrived in the summer of the year 64. As a fire tore through the heart of Rome, reducing centuries of history to charred skeletons of timber and stone, the legend suggests Nero stood on the Tower of Maecenas, dressed in stage costume, singing about the fall of Troy. Whether he actually played his lyre while the city burned is debated, but the psychological truth behind the legend is undeniable. To Nero, the burning of Rome was not a humanitarian catastrophe. It was a magnificent backdrop. It was the ultimate set piece for his personal drama. While the plebeians scrambled for their lives, Nero saw an opportunity to clear the clutter of an old, cramped city to make room for his grandest vision yet. On the very ground where thousands of homes had stood, Nero began the construction of the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. This was not merely a palace, it was a sprawling landscape of artificiality that stretched across over 100 acres in the center of the city. He commissioned forests to be planted where streets had been, and an artificial lake to be dug where families had lived for generations. The palace itself was a fever dream of opulence. Its walls were crusted with gold and inlaid with mother-of-pearl and precious stones. In the dining rooms, the ceilings were fitted with ivory panels that rotated, showering guests with a constant rain of flower petals and expensive perfumes. The centerpiece was a dining hall that revolved on its axis, mimicking the movement of the celestial bodies. When the project reached a state of functional completion, Nero surveyed the staggering excess and remarked that he could at last begin to live like a human being. The statement was the pinnacle of his narcissism. For Nero, human meant something entirely different than it did for the subjects who were taxed into poverty to pay for his gold-leafed walls. He had a bronze statue of himself, the Colossus Neronus, erected in the vestibule. It stood 120 feet tall, a towering monument to a man who truly believed the universe revolved around his whims. As he moved through his golden halls, Nero was entirely insulated from the mounting resentment of the legions and the Senate. He continued to compete in the Olympic Games, demanding that every crown be awarded to him, even in events he didn't finish. He believed his own press, his own paid clappers, and his own reflection in the polished marble. He was the artist emperor, a creature of pure aesthetics who had long ago severed ties with the mundane responsibilities of governance. He didn't see the end coming because he couldn't imagine a world that would choose to silence such a magnificent voice. Even at the very end, as the soldiers closed in and he prepared to take his own life, his final words were not of regret for a city burned or a people betrayed. It was the final tragic flourish of a man who lived his entire life in a play of his own making, never realizing that for everyone else the performance had become a nightmare. When the curtain fell on Nero's theatrical delusions, the Roman world breathed a collective sigh of relief, hoping the stage lights of imperial madness had finally flickered out. They endured the stoic discipline of Marcus Aurelius, a man who ruled with a heavy heart and a philosopher's mind, bringing a decade of somber intellectual stability to the throne. But heredity is a cruel lottery, and the transition from the philosopher king to his son was a descent from the heights of human reason into the depths of primal savagery. Commodus did not want to be a thinker, a poet, or a singer. He didn't care for the subtle manipulations of the Senate or the intricate dance of diplomacy. Commodus wanted to be a monster. If Nero's reign was a tragedy of vanity, the reign of Commodus was a horror show of physical obsession. He looked at the vast, complex machinery of the Roman Empire and saw only one thing: a massive budget for his own blood-soaked fantasies. The shift was immediate and jarring. The dignity of the office, so carefully preserved by his father, was discarded like a worn-out garment. In its place, Commodus cultivated a persona that bordered on the blasphemous. He didn't just admire the myths of old, he intended to inhabit them. He discarded the traditional purple robes of his station, finding them too restrictive for a man of his supposed divinity. Instead, he began to appear in public wearing the pelt of a Nemean lion draped over his shoulders, the paws tied across his chest, and the beast's head resting atop his own golden hair. In his hand, he carried a massive club of polished wood. To walk through the corridors of the Palatine was no longer to meet an emperor, but to encounter a man playing at being Hercules reborn. He was no longer a servant of the state. He was a god made of muscle and entitlement, and he expected the world to bow before his physical prowess. He went so far as to rename the very foundations of Roman identity to reflect this obsession. The city of Rome, the eternal center of the world, was renamed Colonia Commodana. The legions were renamed, the grain fleet was renamed, and even the months of the calendar were discarded. Each of the 12 months was replaced with one of his own many titles, including Amazonius and Herculeus. For a brief, delusional window in history, a Roman citizen would wake up in the month of Commodus, in the city of Commodus, protected by the army of Commodus. It was a total erasure of the past, a systematic attempt to swallow the world whole until nothing remained of the Roman state but his own reflection. But the most terrifying aspect of his madness was not his ego, but his bloodlust. The Colosseum, the symbol of Roman grandeur and cruelty, became his private playground. It was no longer enough for the emperor to sit in the imperial box and watch professional gladiators bleed for the crowd's entertainment. Commodus needed to feel the spray of blood on his own skin. He descended into the pit, fully armed and armored, to face opponents in the sand. However, this was not a display of bravery. It was a choreographed massacre. He would never risk his life in a fair fight. Instead, he sought out the most vulnerable targets to satisfy his need for dominance. Reports from the era describe scenes that seem more like nightmares than historical accounts. Commodus would gather the city's unfortunates, men who had lost their legs to war, accident, or disease, and have them brought into the center of the arena. He would have them bound together in a mass, then dress them as giants or mythical monsters. Armed with his heavy club, the emperor would then set upon them, beating the helpless men to death one by one, while the Senate and the citizenry were forced to watch in a silence that must have tasted like ash. To Commodus, this wasn't an act of cowardice. It was a ritual reenactment of Hercules slaying the giants. He was living out a storyboard of his own creation, and the lives of the Roman people were merely expendable props. When he wasn't slaughtering the disabled, he was turning his bow on the natural world. He was undeniably skilled with a weapon, but he used that skill to perform acts of surgical cruelty that horrified even the most jaded spectators. On a single day, he was said to have killed 100 lions with 100 javelins, never once missing his mark. He particularly favored the use of crescent-headed arrows designed specifically to decapitate ostriches as they ran at full speed across the arena floor. After the birds were headless, their bodies would continue to run for several paces, a sight that reportedly filled the emperor with immense joy. On one occasion, after such a display, he walked toward the seating area of the senators, holding a severed, twitching ostrich head in one hand and his bloody sword in the other. He didn't say a word. He simply gestured toward them, a silent, gore-streaked promise that their necks could be next. The majesty of the natural world, brought from the furthest reaches of the empire at staggering expense, was extinguished in seconds for the sake of a bored man's vanity. The financial cost of this obsession was as devastating as the moral one. Rome was hemorrhaging gold to keep the spectacle alive. Commodus viewed the imperial treasury not as a resource for the state, but as a personal account to fund his gladiatorial career. He considered himself a professional performer and demanded to be paid as such. Every time he stepped into the arena to slaughter a few tethered animals or terrified cripples, he charged the city an exorbitant fee, frequently 1,000,000 sesterces per appearance. He was a professional athlete who owned the stadium, the referees, the opposition, and the very laws of the game, and he was bankrupting the greatest empire on earth to fund his bloody cosplay. The majesty of the natural world, brought from the furthest reaches of the empire at staggering expense, was extinguished in seconds for the sake of a bored man's vanity. The financial cost of this obsession was as devastating as the moral one. Rome was hemorrhaging gold to keep the spectacle alive. Commodus viewed the imperial treasury not as a resource for the state, but as a personal account to fund his gladiatorial career. He considered himself a professional performer and demanded to be paid as such. Every time he stepped into the arena to slaughter a few tethered animals or terrified cripples, he charged the city an exorbitant fee, frequently 1,000,000 sesterces per appearance. He was a professional athlete who owned the stadium, the referees, the opposition, and the very laws of the game, and he was bankrupting the greatest empire on earth to fund his bloody cosplay. The majesty of the natural world, brought from the furthest reaches of the empire at staggering expense, was extinguished in seconds for the sake of a bored man's vanity. The financial cost of this obsession was as devastating as the moral one. Rome was hemorrhaging gold to keep the spectacle alive.
But if the previous years were a hunt, the reign that followed was a fever dream, a hallucination from which the Roman establishment could not wake. The predator that finally cornered the Roman spirit didn't come with a sword or a legion of battle-hardened veterans. It came dressed in purple silk, face painted with vermilion and gold, preceded by the rhythmic thumping of drums and the clashing of Syrian cymbals. At 14 years old, Varius Avitus Bassianus, the boy history would remember as Elagabalus, didn't just walk into the city, he invaded its soul. He was the hereditary high priest of the sun god El Gabal, a deity from Emesa, whose power was concentrated in a massive, unhewn black meteorite. To the Romans, who valued the stern, cold marble of Jupiter and the stoic dignity of the Senate, this was not just a change in leadership, it was a cultural earthquake. The boy emperor did not arrive in Rome to learn its ways, he arrived to replace them. He brought the black stone with him, mounting it upon a chariot encrusted with jewels. In a display that baffled and terrified the onlookers, the emperor of the world walked backward the entire distance from the city gates to his new temple on the Palatine hill. He refused to turn his back on his god, keeping his eyes fixed on the meteorite while servants held his arms to prevent him from stumbling. In that single, awkward, backwards march, the Roman world was turned upside down. The center of gravity had shifted from the forum to the desert. This wasn't merely the eccentricity of a teenager with too much power. It was a systematic dismantling of everything it meant to be Roman. The boy emperor viewed the ancient Roman pantheon with a kind of casual, aristocratic disdain. Jupiter, the king of the gods, who had watched over the republic and the empire for centuries, was suddenly demoted. Elagabalus declared that his sun god was the supreme deity, and all other gods, even Vesta, even Mars, were merely his servants. To the Roman mind, this was more than heresy. It was a betrayal of the contract between the city and the divine. The shock deepened as the city watched the emperor's daily life. He loathed the traditional Roman toga, the heavy wool garment that symbolized the gravity and responsibility of a citizen. He called it a burial shroud. Instead, he draped himself in flowing, translucent silks from the East, garments that the Roman elite considered the height of effeminacy and decadence. He wore necklaces of pearls and tiaras that glittered under the Italian sun, appearing more like a foreign queen than a commander of legions. He spent his days dancing around altars, his movements fluid and rhythmic, sacrificing hundreds of bulls, while the air grew thick with the heavy, sweet scent of Syrian incense, a smell that began to replace the metallic tang of blood and iron that usually defined the Roman court. But the true breaking point, the moment where the sacred was not just ignored but violated, came when Elagabalus turned his attention to the Vestal virgins. For over a millennium, the Vestals had been the heartbeat of Rome.
They were the keepers of the eternal flame, the sacred fire that could never be allowed to go out, lest the city fall. Their chastity was not just a moral requirement, it was a civic necessity. To touch a Vestal virgin was a capital crime, punishable by being buried alive. Elagabalus didn't just touch one, he married her. He took Aquilia Severa from the house of the Vestals and brought her to the imperial bed. When the Senate recoiled in horror, waiting for the sky to fall or the earth to open, the boy emperor offered a justification that felt like a mockery of their entire belief system. He told them that a marriage between a high priest and a high priestess would produce godlike children. To the Romans, this wasn't a holy union, it was a spiritual rape of the state. Yet even this sacrilege was only one facet of his obsession with the inversion of identity. Elagabalus existed in a state of permanent transition, defying the rigid gender roles that held Roman society together. He was known to frequent the taverns and brothels of the city, not as a customer, but as a participant. He would stand at the doors of the palace, painted and dressed as a woman, soliciting passers-by. He married a blonde chariot driver named Heracles, whom he referred to as his husband, and it was said he delighted in being called Heracles's queen. He even went as far as to offer immense sums of money to any physician who could perform a surgical sex change, seeking a physical transformation to match the interior reality he felt. In the hyper-masculine world of the Roman military and political elite, where a man's worth was measured by his dominance and his restraint, Elagabalus was an impossibility. He was a ruler who chose to be ruled, a master who sought to be a servant. This was the ultimate expression of the divine madness. It wasn't the violent, thrashing insanity of a Caligula or the artistic vanity of a Nero. It was something more alien. Elagabalus was attempting to recreate Rome in the image of a foreign sun, a place where the old rules of gravity, gender, and godhood no longer applied. He turned the palace into a theater of the absurd, where guests were showered with so many rose petals that they reportedly smothered to death, and where the most important government posts were handed out based on the physical beauty of the candidates rather than their administrative skill. The Roman people looked on as their ancient traditions were treated like playthings. The Senate was forced to watch as the emperor's mother and grandmother were given seats in their chamber, an unprecedented intrusion into a sanctuary of male authority. The religious calendar was rewritten. The very identity of the Roman citizen, tempered by centuries of war, law, and stoicism, was being dissolved in a vat of perfume and silk. The empire had survived madmen who killed their subjects, but it didn't know how to survive a boy who wanted to delete its history. By elevating his own desires and his foreign god above the foundation of the state, Elagabalus had achieved the total inversion of Roman values. He had turned the capital of the world into a temple for a god they didn't understand, led by a priest they couldn't recognize as a man. The tension was no longer a political disagreement, it was a metaphysical crisis. The city was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the friction between the old world and this new, strange sun would finally ignite. That friction did not lead to a fire that burned the city to the ground, at least not at first. Instead, it produced a heat that warped the very air the Romans breathed, distorting the familiar shapes of their world into something unrecognizable. The strange sun of the east had risen, and under its blinding light, the boundary between a joke and a tragedy began to dissolve. For Elagabalus, the purple of the imperial office was not a burden of duty, but a costume for a performance that never ended. He was a teenager with the absolute power of a god and the bored, cruel imagination of a child who has played with his toys for far too long. He looked upon the ancient traditions of Rome and saw only the rigid gray architecture of a prison. To break that prison, he turned to the most dangerous weapon in a tyrant's arsenal, his sense of humor. It was a brand of comedy that left the city paralyzed. This was the era of the prank as a lethal art form, where a dinner invitation was no longer a sign of social standing, but a potential death warrant wrapped in silk. We must imagine the high-ranking senators, men who had spent their lives navigating the treacherous waters of Roman politics, walking into the imperial dining hall with their hearts hammering against their ribs. They were greeted not with the stern dignity of a Caesar, but with a scene of impossible luxury that felt from the very first moment like a trap. The most infamous of these gatherings has since passed into the darker corners of legend, the banquet of flowers. It began with the standard opulence one might expect from a boy who insisted on treading only on gold dust or linen. The wine flowed, the music was a hypnotic drone of flutes and drums, and the air was thick with the perfume of thousands of blossoms. But as the night reached its peak, a subtle shift occurred. A mechanical groan issued from the heights of the ceiling, and the panels above the guests began to swing open. At first, it must have seemed like a gesture of divine favor. A light rain of rose petals and violets drifted down, coating the tables and the shoulders of the elite. There was laughter, perhaps even a moment of genuine wonder. But the rain did not stop. It became a deluge. Hundreds of pounds, then thousands of fresh blooms cascaded from the rafters in a relentless, suffocating tide. The guests, weighed down by their heavy robes and dulled by the wine, found themselves struggling to stand as the petals rose to their knees, then their waists, then their throats. It is a haunting image. The most powerful men in the world, buried alive under a mountain of beauty. Elagabalus watched from his elevated couch, leaning on a silken elbow, likely smiling as the muffled cries of his guests were silenced by the sweet, cloying scent of the violet. In his mind, there was no horror in this. To die in a sea of flowers was a poetic end, a blurring of the line between the aesthetic and the lethal. It was the ultimate joke played by a god who found the physical limitations of humans to be a hilarious inconvenience. This was the peak of what we might call his divine madness, a state where reality no longer applied to the man at the center of the world. When he wasn't suffocating his guests with flora, he was starving them with shadows. He would invite the common people or low-ranking officials to a feast of spectacular proportions. The tables would groan under the weight of peacocks' tongues, camels' heels, and fish brought from the farthest reaches of the empire. But as the guests reached out to take a bite, their teeth would shatter. The bread was made of stone. The fruit was carved from marble. The roasted meats were fashioned from wax, painted with such exquisite detail that the eye could not tell the difference until the jaw felt the shock of the impact. While his guests sat in pained silence, nursing their broken mouths, Elagabalus would sit before them and consume the actual versions of those very same dishes. He wanted them to feel the gap between what they saw and what truly existed. He was teaching them that under his rule, their senses were no longer to be trusted. The world was whatever he said it was. If he said a stone was a loaf of bread, then your hunger was merely a failure of your own imagination. The terror was not confined to the dining rooms. It spilled out into the streets and the great arenas where the public gathered. Elagabalus had a fondness for the chaotic energy of a crowd, and he delighted in injecting a sudden, sharp needle of fear into their collective experience. During the games, he would sometimes order his guards to release a collection of venomous snakes into the tightly packed stands. As the serpents slithered between the feet of the spectators, the resulting stampede often claimed more lives than the bites themselves. He would watch the panic from the Imperial box, fascinated by the way 1,000 people could be moved like a single frantic animal by the simple addition of a few reptiles. He treated the Roman people like a laboratory for his whims. He would hold lotteries where he threw tokens into the crowds. A lucky citizen might catch a voucher for 10 pounds of gold or a team of fine horses, but the person standing right next to them might catch a token that entitled them to 10 dead flies, a box of scorpions, or a death sentence. To Elagabalus, the gold and the scorpions were of equal value because they both produced the same result, a moment of pure, unadulterated surprise. He had reached a point where the only thing that could pierce his boredom was the sight of the unexpected. The palace itself became a place of nightmares. He kept a collection of lions and leopards, which he called his friends. He had them tamed, or so he claimed, and would frequently set them loose in the guest chambers in the middle of the night. Imagine waking from a deep sleep in the heart of the imperial residence to find a full-grown lion prowling at the foot of your bed. Elagabalus found it uproarious when his guests, paralyzed by fear, would leap from their windows or suffer heart attacks on the spot. When the lions did occasionally revert to their natural instincts and maul a visitor, the emperor viewed it as a failure of the guest's spirit, not the animal's training. By this stage, the city of Rome was no longer a political entity. It was a fever dream. The senators, the soldiers, and the citizens were no longer living in a republic or even a traditional monarchy. They were trapped inside the psyche of a boy who had looked at the sun for too long and decided that he, too, was a fire that could consume everything it touched. The friction had ignited, and as the strange sun climbed higher, the shadows it cast over the empire grew long, distorted, and increasingly red. Those red shadows were not merely optical illusions cast by a flickering sun, but the physical symptoms of a civilization that was, quite literally, poisoning itself from the inside out. To understand the erratic behavior of the men who wore the purple, we have to look past the scandalous chronicles and into the very grit of Roman life. We must look at the water, the wine, and the blood. For decades, historians have puzzled over the sudden shift from the calculated pragmatism of Augustus to the frantic, blood-soaked whims of his successors. One of the most persistent theories suggests that the madness of the emperors was not a defect of character, but a slow-moving neurological disaster caused by the very luxury that defined their status. This is the lead pipe theory, a forensic look at how the Roman obsession with comfort may have eroded the Roman mind. The Roman elite lived in a world saturated with lead. It was in the pipes that brought water to their private villas. It was in the makeup used by their wives, and most significantly, it was in their food. The Romans had a particular fondness for a syrup called sapa, made by boiling down unfermented grape juice. To ensure the syrup was as sweet as possible, it had to be prepared in lead vessels. The lead reacted with the acid in the grapes to create lead acetate, or sugar of lead. This toxic additive was used to flavor everything from expensive wines to delicate sauces. While the common citizen drank water from public fountains and ate simple grains, the emperor and his inner circle were consuming concentrated doses of a heavy metal that the human body cannot easily expel. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning, known as Saturnism, read like a biography of the mid-century Caesars. It begins with physical ailments like gout and abdominal pain, but it quickly moves to the brain. It causes profound irritability, insomnia, hallucinations, and a loss of impulse control. When we read of Caligula's sudden violent outbursts or his inability to sleep more than a few hours a night, we are looking at a textbook case of a prefrontal cortex under siege. Lead mimics calcium, crossing the blood-brain barrier and disrupting the neurotransmitters that allow a person to regulate their emotions. The men leading the Western world were not just eccentric. They were likely suffering from a chemical lobotomy, their judgment dissolved by the very vintage they drank to celebrate their power. Yet lead was not the only toxin running through the halls of the Palatine Hill. There was also the matter of the bloodline. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was obsessed with the idea of divine lineage, a belief that their family was fundamentally different from the rest of humanity. To preserve this perceived purity, they turned inward. The family tree did not branch out, it coiled. We see a dizzying pattern of endogamy, where uncles married nieces and cousins married cousins to keep the power within a closed circuit. Biology, however, is not a fan of exclusivity. While they thought they were refining the blood of gods, they were actually inviting the ghosts of recessive traits to the surface. Geneticists point to the high frequency of epilepsy, migraine disorders, and physical deformities within the imperial house as evidence of a thinning gene pool. When you narrow the genetic variety of a family, you increase the likelihood of neurological instability. The divine madness might have been nothing more than a series of hereditary glitches, passed down like a cursed inheritance from one generation to the next, until the crown sat upon a head that was biologically incapable of stability. But even if we could strip away the lead pipes and the tangled family trees, we would still be left with the chair itself. This leads us to the psychological diagnosis of Caesarean madness, or megalomania on a scale the world had never seen before. We have to consider the sheer trauma of the position. To be a Roman emperor was to live in a state of total, permanent isolation. From the moment a man assumed the title, every person he met was either a subordinate, a flatterer, or a potential assassin. There were no peers. There were no checks on his behavior. If an emperor decided that the moon was made of silver, no one in his vicinity would dare suggest otherwise. Under these conditions, the human ego does not simply grow, it deforms. Psychologists suggest that when a person is granted absolute power and stripped of all social consequences, the empathy centers of the brain begin to atrophy. They lose the ability to see others as human beings, viewing them instead as props in a grand personal theater. This is where the bizarre habits truly take root. The desire to make a horse a consul or to declare war on the ocean is not necessarily the act of a broken brain, but the act of a man testing the limits of a reality that no longer has any walls. It is a desperate attempt to feel something, to find a boundary in a world where every whim is instantly gratified. They were men playing at being gods, and the tragedy of the human condition is that we are simply not built to handle that much light without going blind. This forces us to ask the hard question that haunts the ruins of the Forum. Were these men fundamentally broken before they took the throne, or did the throne itself possess a transformative, corrosive power? We often want to believe that the monsters of history are anomalies, accidents of nature that we can explain away with a medical diagnosis or a chemical theory. It is comforting to think that Nero was just a victim of lead poisoning, or that Caligula was just a product of a bad gene. But the truth might be more uncomfortable. It is possible that the Roman system was so perfectly designed for absolute control that it functioned as a machine for creating madness. The position of emperor demanded a level of vigilance and a degree of narcissism that is incompatible with a healthy mind. To survive, you had to be paranoid. To rule, you had to be a megalomaniac. The divine madness was perhaps not a disease, but an adaptation, a way for a human mind to survive the crushing weight of an empire that demanded its leader be more than a man. As we look back at the distorted shadows they left behind, we see a reflection not just of their individual failures, but of the danger of a society that places the entire weight of the world on a single, fragile neck. The fire that consumed Rome was lit by many torches, some forged in the lead mines, some in the marriage bed, and some in the cold, lonely height of the imperial throne itself. But the height of that throne was an illusion, a precarious peak where the air grew thin and the perspective warped. When the distance between the man and the god grew too wide, the ground beneath the imperial feet inevitably began to liquefy. It is the great paradox of the Roman psyche. They built a system that demanded a deity, yet they were a people who fundamentally understood the weight of steel. The same hands that once raised a golden scepter eventually found their way to a dagger's hilt, proving that even the most elaborate mask of divinity could be shattered by a few inches of sharpened iron. Caligula was the first to learn that his immortality was a fiction. He had spent his brief reign demanding the worship of the heavens, yet his end came in the most earthly of places. In the dim, claustrophobic shadows of a covered walkway during the Palatine Games, the illusion of the living God vanished. It wasn't an invading army or a foreign assassin that struck him down, but his own protectors. The Praetorian Guard, the very men sworn to be his shadow, became his executioners. In that cramped, echoing tunnel, the screams of the emperor were not the roars of a deity, but the panicked cries of a terrified young man, discovering that his blood was as warm and as vulnerable as any gladiator's. They struck him again and again, 30 times in total, as if trying to kill the ghost of his arrogance along with his body. For Nero, the end was a slow, agonizing descent into the dirt. Abandoned by the Senate and declared a public enemy, the man who once imagined himself the world's greatest performer found himself shivering in a suburban villa, draped in a coarse cloak he would have once found revolting. He waited for the hoofbeats of the approaching cavalry, his fingers trembling as he held the blade. Even as the world closed in, his vanity remained his only companion, his final words a lament for the artist the world was about to lose. But the world didn't mourn a musician, it purged a tyrant. With a single jagged cut to the throat, the voice that had commanded the Roman world was silenced, choked by the reality he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. This was the recurring rhythm of the Roman tragedy. The Praetorian Guard, originally formed to preserve the emperor's life, became the ultimate arbiters of his worth. They were the silent witnesses to every depravity, until the weight of the emperor's madness became too heavy for even their iron shoulders. Perhaps no end was more visceral than that of Elagabalus, a teenager who tried to force an empire to worship a foreign sunstone, found himself cornered in a common latrine. There was no dignity, no poetic last words. His body was dragged through the streets and tossed into the muddy waters of the Tiber like common refuse. As his remains drifted toward the sea, Rome watched from the banks, reminded once again that the purple robe offered no protection against the gravity of human vengeance. They had reached for the stars and found only the cold touch of the grave, proving that the divine madness always ended in a very human silence.
The silence of the grave is where the work of the historian truly begins. When the blood on the palace floors had dried and the echoes of the assassins' blades had faded, the ink started to flow. But we must always consider the hand that held the pen. The stories we have inherited, the horse appointed to the Senate, the singing in the streets of a burning city, the golden gluttony of the imperial table, were largely recorded by the senatorial class. These were men who viewed the emperors as usurpers of their ancient rights, men who had every reason to paint their dead masters as monsters to justify the rise of the next regime. It is almost certain that the shadows were deepened and the crimes exaggerated to serve the political needs of those who survived. Yet even after peeling back the layers of political spin and aristocratic spite, a haunting truth persists. The records may be biased, but the scars on the Roman psyche were real. The sheer repetition of these tales across different sources suggests a fundamental breakdown of the human spirit at the very top of the social pyramid. We are forced to confront the terrifying reality of what happens when an individual is elevated above the laws of nature and man. When a person is told from birth that their every desire is a divine command and that their whim can reshape the world, the boundary between reality and hallucination begins to dissolve. The madness of the emperors was not merely an accident of birth or a flaw of character. It was an occupational hazard of the throne itself. This historical spectacle forces us to reflect on the inherent fragility of any civilization that places its entire weight upon the shoulders of one fallible human being. We see a world where the life of a province could be decided by the mood of a man who hadn't slept, or where the economy of a continent could be drained to satisfy a single night of theatrical vanity. It is a sobering reminder that the structures we build to protect us, the laws, the bureaucracies, and the social contracts, are often the only things standing between a functioning society and a descent into the personal nightmares of its rulers. Perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is not that the empire had madmen at its helm, but that it continued to function while they were there. The grain ships still arrived at the docks of Ostia.
The tax collectors still kept their ledgers, and the frontiers remained manned by soldiers who had never seen the face of the man they were sworn to die for. The Roman system had become a self-sustaining organism, a vast machine of governance that possessed more internal wisdom than the individuals who claimed to own it. It was a masterpiece of collective effort that proved more durable than the erratic whims of its mortal gods. Looking back through the centuries, these emperors appear as flashes of lightning, violent, unpredictable, and ultimately brief, against the steady, enduring stone of the Roman world. They were the turbulence in a great river, not the current itself. We remember their names and their eccentricities because they represent the extreme limits of the human condition under the pressure of total authority. But the true legacy of Rome lies elsewhere. It lies in the resilience of a people who could weather the storms of insanity and keep the lights of civilization burning. The empire did not flourish because of its leaders. It endured in spite of them.